Hi, this is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller. Welcome to the channel. Please subscribe if you're new here. And yes, I'm wearing shades because, of course, one must look cool. And also because behind the camera, which you can't see, is the lovely view I have of the mountain across the valley from me. Well, it's a hill, really. And it's a really sunny, lovely day. And it's great to sort of have some time in the hideout to do some filming. And we're going to do a long-promised video today, which is about the sort of, how can I put it, the emblematic role of Berlin, the city, the place, the spirit in the music of the 1970s and why it was such a thing. And it was particularly a thing in 1977, as you'll see. And if you're a rock and roll fan, especially if you're a rock and roll fan of the more sort of Eurocentric rock music from the 70s and early 80s, you know, you'll already be aware of this sort of emblematic quality, as I say, this iconic quality. And I'm going to talk about a few records specifically, but you'll have your own ideas. It'll be interesting to see if you put in the comments and the feedback, the things that you think are relevant to this. Because I could have gone on and on about this for hours, but we'll start. So, Berlin, where does Berlin come into rock music? Well, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? It comes into rock music pretty much as soon as rock music itself is born. Now, just to elaborate a bit, what do I mean by rock music as opposed to rock and roll or pop music? Well, my take on it is this. I think rock music is music which is subjective, individual, rebellious, and is primarily about a non-universal view of things. Pop music is universal, it has universal appeal, it looks at subjects which are sort of like of interest to all of us, hence romantic love and sexuality being a very big thing in popular music. Whereas rock music's a bit broader and it could be about almost anything, and it didn't have to have universal appeal. An interesting example is David Bowie, who of course had lots of hit singles and, you know, recorded some pop songs. So let's be clear about this. Rock musicians sometimes make pop songs, and pop musicians occasionally make a rock record, which is not something that everybody can relate to. A pop record is something for everybody. A rock record will be for some and not for others, depending on their environment, their upbringing, their personal, their sort of, you know, view of the world, their personality, their experiences. So it's about subjectivity and, you know, individual sort of experience of the world and how you relate to rock music, which is why people like different things, of course, isn't it? You know, so that's my take on it. So rock music to me is more about that than actual tone colours and timbres. It's about an attitude. I guess you could say that, you know, it really begins with the feedback experiments of the Who, the Yardbirds, the Kinks, guitar distortion, what have you. And those are important things. For me, rock music really begins around about the same time in 1965 with the founding of two bands, two of my favourite bands, and I'm going to refer to both of them. And they were The Doors and the Velvet Underground, both of whom were formed in 1965. And this is the Doors' debut album, which I'm going to do a video about this at some point. I could go on and on about this, and I probably will. And of course, the thing with the Doors is that they were bright lads. You know, you had two great, amazing sort of properly trained musicians, Krieger and Densmore, you know, jazz guys, what have you. Had Ray Manzarek. They were all interested in the blues. Krieger was into flamenco. Morrison was into the blues, all those things. But he's a big reader. So was Ray Manzarek. They'd been to film school in UCLA. So this album is stuffed with literary references. And you can talk about Bob Dylan all you like. And Bob Dylan, obviously, you know, Nobel Prize for Literature, important stuff. But this was full of direct literary references to all sorts of books, particularly European books. It's very, very interesting. We'll talk about that another time. And on here is a song called the Alabama Song, Whiskey Bar, written by Brecht and Weil from Mahogany, which was a sort of a cabaret opera. And this is where it really comes into it. David Bowie did a version in '79 as a single, Alabama Song, we know it as. And basically, the thing is, if you look at Berlin in the post-war period, that's post-First World War, you enter what you call the Weimar Republic, and the whole country started to recover. There were the punishing reparations, which a lot of people say the reason why World War II happened. And it was a very decadent place, particularly the city of Berlin. There was all sorts of things going on. It's estimated there were a huge number of women in prostitution in Berlin, street prostitutes. And this is called them the boot girls. And the colours of their boots indicated what their sort of, you know, specialities were. So, you know, if you if you want to go right to the extreme end of things in the bathroom, avoid a girl in Berlin with green boots is the advice, you know. So they were looking back to that, and Brecht, of course, poet, playwright, radical sort of left-wing anarchist type figure, and you know, and so the Doors were interested in that, interesting stuff. And at the same time, the Velvet Underground were forming, and of course it was Reed and Cale. And if you look at the original lineup of the Velvet Underground, you had Lou Reed, from obviously American, you had John Cale from South Wales, Garnant, and he was classically trained avant-garde musician. You had Nico coming in from Germany, and of course you had Mo Tucker, the wonderful Mo Tucker, with a primitive, simple drumming style, and Sterling Morrison, who's often disregarded, really important rhythm guitarist, bassist, an all-round good guy. And of course they had a very Eurocentric feel, and they were sort of fated by Andy Warhol. And Andy Warhol, of course, his family were from Eastern Europe. Is it Russia or the Ukraine? I'm not certain. But you know, basically modern art moved to New York, away from Paris and Berlin and other European cities when World War II started. So modernism begins in Europe and makes its way over to New York. So it was nothing strange about John Kay leaving South Wales, where modernism wasn't happening in any big way, and go to New York to seek out the top avant-garde musicians, and fell in with Reed. And you know, together they invented, you know, avant-garde rock and roll, which is great. And Nico, of course, she'd had this career growing up in Germany, and you know, she did a career as a model, as a film star. She used to hang out with lots of rock stars. And this is a Nico bootleg called Death and the Maiden, which a friend of mine bought me years ago, and it's great. It's on blue vinyl, and I'll just show it to you. And there you go, lovely. And so Nico brought a genuine Germanic thing to it, you know, and so you had a band which were at least half European. Now, before Mo Tucker was in the Velvets, they had a Scots drummer called Angus MacLeish, who was a kind of hippie figure. So, you know, and Elvis Presley had Scottish roots. So there you go. So you had European influences in the Doors, and you had European sort of musicians with the Velvets. So that to me is where rock music really begins. And you get that sort of very sort of strange stuff that not everybody could relate to. And with the Velvets, you had things like the Saka Masok song, Venus in Furs, and sort of Saka Masok, you know, Germanic figure. So there you go. So straight away, you're starting to see the influence of European, profoundly German sort of references in rock music. And of course, at that point then, a controversial but interesting thing was the iconography of fascism and Nazism. And of course, Hell's Angels used to wear sort of swastikas, and famously Ron Ashton from the Stooges was a big collector of Nazi memorabilia, and he'd wear a brown shirt on stage and he'd wear the swastika armband and stuff. And it's just all very unpleasant. But it was a way then for young people in rock and roll rebellion to say, you know, I'm a badass. We reject the straight world. Yeah, you won the war for us, but you know, don't oppress us now. Let us have the freedom that we wouldn't have had the Axis powers won. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic there. And of course, it fell from favour in the punk period, where people were saying, you know, well, this is all very well and good, but it's not very pleasant and it's not very nice. So that's an aspect of it. But Berlin in the 20s, the Weimar Republic, deemed to be very decadent. And that was one of the things that Hitler's boys, you know, the Nazis, were against. They were against this sort of decadence. They were against modern art. And the cabaret scene was very big in Berlin, you know, and that comes through in the novels of Christopher Isherwood, Goodbye to Berlin. Famously, the film made of those novels, Cabaret, which was a big hit in the mid-70s with Liza Minnelli, Joel Grey, and, you know, lots of sort of things like that. So as you can see, it was still in the air. So there was that Germanic influence over people like the Velvets, the Doors, the Stooges. I call it Germanic, but generally it was sort of broadly more Eurocentric. So when we look at Berlin specifically, we think of Weimar, the Weimar Republic, and what have you, and you see it in all sorts of things. And this is an interesting one. This is an album called Astounding Sounds, Amazing Music by one of my favourite bands, Hawkwind. This is their 1976 record, and this is in some editions this is the back cover. On this one, this is the front cover, and that's the back cover, which is upside down because the way it's printed, and that's a Weimar eagle. And this is on you because Hawkwind did a song called Steppenwolf, which was based on the novel by Hermann Hesse, which is written and set in Germany during the Weimar Republic period. And there's a video specifically about that song in the sort of playlist for rock and roll on the channel. So, you know, it was commonplace even in psychedelia, even in something like Hawkwind. That sort of imagery was referred to, of course, in the work of people like David Bowie and Roxy Music. And an example from Roxy Music came in their fourth album. I'm just going to cover up the naughty bits. This is Country Life, which is Roxy's fourth album. And there's a song in here called Bittersweet, which is partially in German. And it's this lovelorn ballad. And it's got this very strident cabaret feel, which if you ever hear any genuine German cabaret songs in the time, it's actually quite like that. So that was there. And, you know, the sort of essence of style and decadence of Berlin was deemed to be a big thing in the sort of glam rock end of things. And I mean, by that, I don't mean Gary Glitter. I don't mean glitter pop. I mean true glam. I'm talking about David Bowie, Roxy Music, Cockney Rebel, what have you. There was also the influence of krautrock. And, you know, when people like the producer Connie Plank from Cologne, who produced people like Kraftwerk and Neu, La Dusseldorf, you know, and even though these were not Berlin bands, they were predominantly sort of Dusseldorf, Cologne, what have you. You know, there was a great interest in Germanic rock, in particularly in Britain in the 70s. Tangerine Dream were popular. There were lots of German prog bands that you never hear about people like Novalis and Holderlin. And, you know, it's a very sort of vibrant scene. Of course, there was Can, who people love. I personally have mixed feelings about Can. I don't think they're anywhere near as important as people say they are, but it's just a personal thing. So, you know, that was there as well. The film Cabaret was popular. It was popular with the rock and roll audience. And the young people growing up who had become the first sort of waves of punk rockers, people like Steve Severin and Susie Sue, you know, they were very fascinated with all that sort of stuff as well. The Elegance and Decadence and what have you. And, you know, it was a sort of pervasive thing. And did it mean these people were right-wing? Well, of course it didn't. I mean, you know, if you look at these people, they'd have been you know, when the real fascists turn up, they'd have been the first ones sent to the wall, you know, sort of, because they were essentially people who were interested in style rather than politics. So it is an interesting thing. It really comes together in 1977. There's an awful lot of references to Berlin in 1977 records. And of course, by the early 60s, after World War II, there were different international zones in Berlin to sort of, you know, try and reconstruct it, stop anybody right-wing getting back in. A lot of people got jobs in sort of similar positions they had during the Nazi regime, which is an interesting thing. And the Berlin Wall went up in the early 60s, and the city was divided in half between the East, you know, the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and the West. And of course the Cold War had been raging for some time then. Both sides had nuclear weapons, and here we are again today in that same sort of standoff, you know. And the wall was there, and it was more than just a symbol. It prevented people from, you know, seeing their loved ones. They were separated. People would jump the wall and what have you. And of course it was a real flashpoint. Checkpoint Charlie was the point where you could apply to go through, and there were tank traps there and what have you, and barbed wire, armed guards, you know, towers, what have you. And anybody who is old enough to remember that will remember what a symbol Berlin was of the imminent nuclear doom that hung over this. And that was another reason why rock and roll was so intense and so sort of decadent and sensual then, because we knew that any moment that could happen. We'd seen the 60s, we'd seen civil rights, we'd seen all those things, we'd seen the Vietnam War, all the protest, and the promise of the counterculture seemed to fade away. And European culture, which is older, more mature, more dragged down perhaps by the weight of history, we related to that. And growing up in that time, we were still under the shadow of World War II. You know, your parents and grandparents and people talked about it constantly, and it still felt that it hung over everything. And the Cold War and the Berlin Wall particularly were emblematic of that. It was a symbol of the reality that we faced, that even though World War II had ended, we'd gone straight into another conflict, a Cold War. And, you know, it was quite a heavy thing. So let's look at 1977. And of course, one of the most celebrated records from 1977 is David Bowie's Low, an enormously influential record and a brilliant record. And in which, you know, half of it or more is instrumental. And minimalist songs, what have you. Brian Eno, some great musicians on there. This was actually recorded at the Chateau d'Herville in France rather than Germany, but it's regarded as the first of the Berlin trilogy. I personally would say Station to Station is, because it contains that important and iconic indicating line in the title track, "The European canon is here," whereas Bowie says, I'm finished with America, I've made some money here, I've pulled it together, I've done my Plastic Soul period, and now I'm going to go back to European sources, to Eurocentric sources. And of course, you know, he covered people like Jacques Brel early in his career. You know, he was somebody who's influenced by European culture, you know. So that came out, I think, February 77. There's some other interesting records at that point which have, you know, Germanic references. Like, for example, there's the first Ultravox album, came out pretty much the same time. That was Ultravox with an exclamation mark, echoing Neu, who influenced John Foxx's Ultravox. And they were were they like the first New Romantic band, or were they the last glam rock band? Who knows? I think of them as sort of like a proto New Romantic band, or a Euromantic band, as I say. All my favorite artists, I would say, are people who have the weight of European history and culture in their lyrics, in their presentation, in the way they think about things, even if it's subconscious. I think that's an important strand in their style, their work and their thinking. And of course, the Stranglers, my favourite band, they did lots and lots of things in the late 70s, early 80s, which referred to international situations, particularly in Europe, because J.J. Bernal, of course, was French. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. Also at that time, we had bands like Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, this is Kraftwerk's Man Machine from 78, which is probably their most famous album, contains The Model, which wasn't a hit single till 3 years later. The single from the album at the time was Neon Lights. I've still got my copy of it on luminous vinyl. And of course, Kraftwerk had a hit single with Autobahn a few years before. 3 of their albums you can get in German and or English, I should say. I have them in both languages. And, you know, they sort of brought this image of Teutonic perfection. And I think Kraftwerk are a rock band. Even when they dropped some acoustic instruments that they used early on in the discography that they don't reissue now, that gets bootlegged, I think they're a rock band. And, you know, when they'd have interviews, they'd say, what are your favourite bands? And they would say MC5, Stooges, you know, Velvet Underground, what have you. So I see Kraftwerk not as a dance group, but as a rock band. And I would argue that at that time, we're sort of told mythology about this. What I recall from when I first heard Kraftwerk were the people buying their records, weren't people going to discos. It might have been this way in the States. They say that lots of sort of black people in the clubs, Puerto Ricans, black people, and people like disco music of all stripes, they say that they listen to them. I'm not so certain that's actually true, but I know in the UK, or certainly where I lived, everybody was into them. It wasn't a discoite, you know, it was all rock and roll fans who were into Kraftwerk. You know, they were more sophisticated, and their songs were rock songs. They had subjectivity. They weren't universal. You know, and they weren't big on lots of lyrics and stuff. They were mostly about textures. So it's interesting stuff. So even though they're from Dusseldorf, they brought that sort of Berlin vibe into things. And, you know, as I say, Low was a big one. Warsaw, Subterraneans, which referred directly to people trapped behind the Berlin Wall, as Bowie said in interviews. And, you know, the fact that the subsequent album, from 78, Heroes, was recorded at the Hansa by the Wall studio overlooking the Berlin Wall. And, you know, Heroes, Sons of the Silent Age, V2 Schneider, a reference to Florian Schneider from Kraftwerk, and of course the V2, the Doodlebug, was the rocket bomb that Hitler used against the UK. So there's all sorts of things in there. And New Cologne is a place, it's where sort of Turkish immigrants lived in Berlin as well. So it's full of sort of, and this is a promo by the look of it, it's got not for sale on it. And there's lots of references in there to the fact that Iggy and Bowie, of course, were living together in the flat in Berlin at that time. So that's quite an important one. Just to expand on Bowie a bit more at the moment, we may as well. Of course, he appeared in the film Christiane F. There's a new TV series that's apparently, which I can't bear to even look at. Great film, very, very harrowing. Of course, it was based on a best-selling autobiography. And it's filmed around Zoo Station in Berlin. Again, which is a very decadent thing with lots of young people selling their bodies. Just absolutely horrible, but, you know, very compelling movie. If you haven't seen it, do. As I say, I've not seen the TV series, and it's probably not going to come up to the original. And great Bowie soundtrack as well from all those albums from that period. So that was a thing too. So Berlin was there, but it got referred to by people you wouldn't expect. And I'm going to do a left field one now, because this is one of my favourite records from that period. And this is Sin After Sin by Judas Priest. That's right, Judas Priest, the heavy metal band. This is their third album, their first major label album. They did a couple of albums for Gull, a really great little record label I really love. And they broke their contract and moved to CBS because they were starving. They weren't making any money. They'd blown people away at the Reading Festival. And a friend of mine was there and saw them. There's a bit of film you can see online. And they're a really amazing, interesting band. You know, they were the Apollonian side of heavy metal as opposed to Dionysiac one. And very interesting lyrics and what have you. And Sin After Sin contains a song called Dissident Aggressor. And I'm just going to show you the sleeve because it's very beautiful. And parts of it were used. This picture on the back, the same picture was used on the Picador cover of The Hospital Ship by Dr. Martin Bax, who's a friend of J.G. Ballard's, around a magazine called Ambit. I know I'm veering off now, but it's interesting stuff. But this is Sin After Sin, and Dissident Aggressor is the last song on the album. And, you know, it's a song which is beloved in the thrash and heavy metal community. I know people have covered it. And what's it about? And it's fascinating. And I'm just going to quote you one verse. Through cracked, blackened memories of unit dispersal, I face the impregnable wall. Now, if you think of Berlin in World War II as the Soviets were coming from the east, the Allies from the west, Hitler was in the bunker in the middle, it's unit dispersal, the armies dispersing units out through the city. Through cracked, blackened memories of unit dispersal, I face the impregnable wall. Now, the impregnable wall, of course, in this case, is the Berlin Wall, which wasn't up during World War II. And there's a line in the song which is repeated several times, which is, I know what I am, I'm Berlin. So the narrator of the song is the spirit of the city of Berlin, with its memories of World War II, with the Cold War reality of the impregnable wall, and Dissident Aggressor is the title of the song. Now, of course, there were all sorts of dissident things going on in Germany in the 70s, the Baader-Meinhof group, what have you. They were happening in Italy as well. Left-wing revolutionary sort of figures doing all sorts of terrorism and naughty stuff. So, you know, Judas Priest, who'd have thought it? Most people know Judas Priest. They broke through in 78 with a sort of football stomp type single called Take on the World. And in America, it's a song called You've Got Another Thing Coming, which is great fun, you know. But this early stuff is really thoughtful. And interestingly, there's a song here called Raw Deal, which is about sort of Fire Island with a guy who's gay picking somebody else up in a bar. And, you know, and it's not really very veiled, you know. It's interesting because Halford later on came out, but it was obvious, I think, to those of us who liked the band, and even in the late 70s that was there. So it's fascinating. You know, there's some lighter stuff. There's some science fiction sort of numbers on here, and there's Sinner, which is a kind of sort of traditional sort of God and the devil type thing, which is great. But, you know, interesting stuff. So Berlin, its decadence, its symbolism, and the reality of Cold War was, you know, even affecting heavy metal. And at that time, heavy metal wasn't big on lyrics about the current thing. It was more about sort of Dionysiac stuff and more straightforward, more poppy subjects, I guess. As time went on, Berlin became more and more referenced all sorts of things. Like if you look at the original sort of Bromley contingent, the punk rockers who formed around the whole Sex Pistols scene, and Malcolm McLaren and the shop at World's End on King's Road around the Sex Pistols. And, you know, I guess we should cover that up. Interestingly, of course, there's a Berlin reference on this record, and that's in the hit single, the fourth single the Pistols released, the final one by the real Pistols, of course, which is Holidays in the Sun. And this is a blue vinyl copy. I got this from Sister Ray. Sister Ray did loads of different editions. At one point I had about 8 different versions in different colours, and I flogged, I think, all of them apart from this one because it's just silly, you know. But I bought them when I was visiting London regularly, and they were pretty cheap and stuff, and they were just irresistible. So Holidays in the Sun, you'll remember I Do Want a Holiday in the Sun, I Want to See the New Bells. And it's a bit of time when the Pistols, they went for a brief break to Berlin, and, you know, they saw the Berlin Wall, and we could probably analyse that song all day, and it's full of contemporary references to things like Centuround sound, which anybody under a certain age wouldn't know what that was. That was a new type of sound used, particularly for disaster movies like Earthquake in the bigger sort of movie theatres, or cinemas as we call them in the UK, in the mid-70s. And, you know, so there you go. So Bowie, Judas Priest, the Sex Pistols, all sorts of other bands. And the more you look, the more you'll find. And I'll just give you a couple more definite sort of references here. If I pick up this album by one of my favourite bands from the late 70s, early 80s, from my big four. My big four in that period are the Stranglers, Magazine, Japan, and John Foxx's Ultravox. They're the bands I was really into at that time, and they're still famous now. This is Japan's Quiet Life. This is a reissue from a few years ago. It's not the recent reissue, it's the one from a few years before that. And it's on double red vinyl. And I've got my original still, and I've got an unplayed original, which I've got. And this came out the very end of 79. And this has got some great stuff on it. And of course, nobody bought it at the time. A few of us did. All us cool people bought it. And it's got a cover of All Tomorrow's Parties by the Velvet Underground, which of course Nico sang at a very Germanic feel. And it's got, you know, things which reference Berlin. For example, there's a song called Halloween. And in that, there's a lyric where David Sylvian sings, slowly emerging a divided Germany, everyone's lost in East Berlin. And that's typical of the sort of mention that the city would get in songs from that time. And you probably know many yourselves. So, you know, do stick them in the comments below. So that's typical of this sort of thing where it was symbolizing that split, you know, and this sort of way that the Western and Eastern world, the Western world was split, because Russia, of course, is a European country, you know, how it was split ideologically, politically, and what have you. And it was a really useful metaphor for all sorts of things, of personal heartbreak, what have you, and feeling like an exile and an outsider, feeling like you're on the other side of the wall. And Japan, of course, and the album before this, Obscure Alternatives, which is 1978, there's a track called Suburban Berlin, you know, which references the same thing. And you know, if you look yourself, you'll see these references all the way throughout music from that period, particularly music from Britain and from Germany. And I don't think it really infected America, because America was in a different place philosophically, economically, it was in a different place. And it took some time for these things to filter over to the States. So that's Japan, Quiet Life, wonderful record. It still pops up now and again. I mean, obviously the wall came down a long time ago. The wall has been down longer now than it was up. It was up for 28 years and it came down over 30 years ago. And we'll remember that German band, the Scorpions, having the hit single Wind of Change, which is a power ballad. I always find it very moving, about following that old path down to Gorky Park and waiting for the wind of change. And, you know, people finally stood up and thought, this is it, we've had enough. And they broke the wall down, the Soviet Union fell. And, you know, according to Francis Fukuyama, it was the end of history. Oh, no, it wasn't. So, you know, that got celebrated. I mean, going back to Hawkwind, this is the Business Trip Live from the early 90s, which is a great album, a live album. It's from when Hawkwind were a three-piece, and it was Dave Brock, Richard Chadwick, who was in bands with Steve Beeman, who I talked to the other day on the channel. You see the interview with Steve on there. And Alan Davey, and a great trio, you know, and they did everything themselves. And, you know, they do things like trigger the synth with the head of the bass and stuff. And it's a wonderful, wonderful record. One of my favourite later Hawkwind albums, and this is the original with a die cut. And a lot of this is instrumental, and there's an instrumental on here called Berlin Access, which is sort of ethereal and beautiful synth thing, and it's quite brief. But obviously it's a reference there back to Steppenwolf on Astounding Sounds, Amazing Music. There's also a track on here called The Day a Wall Came Down, and that's the one that leads into Berlin Access as instrumental. That's a jam, and it obviously references that day when the Berlin Wall came down. So there's a few thoughts about the emblematic and iconic nature of the spirit of Berlin in rock music, and how that informed a generation or more, and how it informed all sorts of different rock music. And really, you know, since the early 80s, that faded away. And maybe it was a good thing, because of course it was fallout from the war and the Cold War. There are very few references like that in the 90s and so on. But as we're seeing in the current situation, there is a spectre haunting the world. It is the spectre of the weight of European history and the ideological struggles, and, you know, the heart of darkness which is there in the European soul, and is something which we both celebrate and decry. You know, it's tough stuff. It's thoughtful stuff. It's something for you to think about. It's now time for me to sign out. I'll see you again soon. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Bye.